Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause for Mrs. Andrea. I request Prachi to come up on the stage and give her a bouquet as a token of appreciation.
I would try to give an overview of technology and the impact that technology has the potential of having on society. Hopefully to inspire all of you as the next generation of engineers to pursue innovating and inventing new technologies. All of us, all four speakers, were invited here as innovators and inventors. While we're very excited to have been invited, we represent the current and, in the near future, the past generation of inventors, whereas all of you represent the future generation. So all of us look forward to seeing where all of you go in the future. While it may seem difficult, wow, the microphone is saying interesting things. While it may seem difficult to invent something, one example of an invention is the microscope, shown. Oh, I may take that. Shown here. Thanks. Shown here. The microscope was originally a little tiny handheld device made of brass, and it was invented in the 17th century. However, over the past 3 centuries, it has grown to be about half the size of this table, and has numerous lenses, up to 20 or 30, and can magnify, hundreds or 1,000 times. This original invention was very, very nice because it was fuel portable. You could easily take it out into a field, look at blades of grass, look at crickets, with high magnification. However, the current microscope has advantages. You can look at things with much higher resolution. You can look at individual cells. It also has a camera on it. You can take recordings. However, because of its size, you are unable to actually take it out into the field and look at things in a natural setting. But using the modern microscope, you're able to get these beautiful pictures. So this is an example of a copepod. Due to the difference in polarization of the different components, you're actually able to tell the difference between things like the whiskers and the antenna on the insect. This is a color picture of coral, stony coral, where you're able to tell the difference between the pockets on the coral where material is taken into the coral so it can live. This is a fossilized bone, where you can actually see the structure of the bone, which gives it its strength. And this is a picture of an array of HeLa cells that was labeled using a fluorescent marker. Because of the ability of a microscope to take pictures in real time and take video, using the microscope, researchers are actually able to watch cell division, look at how cells interact with each other, and identify different structures on the cell, like the cell nucleus and the cell body. However, researchers in the 1950s realized that while the optical microscope was a fabulous piece of equipment, it didn't give them high enough resolution to image things like a simple virus. And that was one of the motivations for the electron microscope. This is a picture of the polio virus, where this is the top view of the virus and this is a side view of the virus. And this is an image of an E. coli cell being attacked by 50 to 100 polio virus. And this little stalk region is actually how the virus injects its genetic material into the cell, thereby infecting the cell and killing the cell. It was pictures like this one and the previous one that actually enabled researchers and biologists to develop a vaccine for the polio virus. Therefore, the electron microscope and that technology is actually what enabled biologists to do their job. So that's kind of one example of how technology and scientists can work hand in hand to solve truly global problems and challenges. However, that's the challenge of the past, and there are many challenges facing society today which now need engineers and technologists to come in and take a step. One example is energy. And this is both an energy generation and energy conservation. So things like solar cells and fusion, as well as new building designs and building materials. So this is an example of a building in LA where they're looking at making an entire side of it out of grass. So basically green material. And also urban infrastructure. So in this case, things like new ways of getting clean water and making water accessible, designing entire cities which are more energy efficient, which have better communication among all the buildings to either redirect energy where it's needed and direct it away from where it's not needed, but also improve communications, so things like telecommunications, so make computer communications more efficient. And then finally, virtual learning, in order to bring learning basically on a global scale. And finally, healthcare. So both have improved personalized medicine, but also improved global healthcare for improved vaccines across the world. So we've started as a world making significant progress in all three areas. In order to do this, we've had to make new materials, new instruments, new equipment. So starting from a ground-up level, because you can't just take your existing technologies and make them incrementally better. In many cases, you actually need to create an entirely new material and then start from that point and create a new device or a new instrument. So you need to completely rethink your old equipment and technology. So an example of this is the invention of a whole new class of nanomaterials. Shown on this slide is a group of materials which are passive. So in this case, it's something called a brush structure, and this is a gallium nitride brush structure. And here are a carbon nanotube, basically cable. So carbon nanotubes are a very interesting material because they're incredibly strong, very conductive, but also very thermally resistant. And researchers are looking at making things like scaffolds and cabling out of carbon nanotubes, because even though they are a nanometer or 2 nanometers in diameter, they can be millimeters long. And when you wind them together to create a cable like this one, you can actually create materials or cables which are stronger than steel, but incredibly lightweight. There are also active materials like the quantum dots shown here and the ferrofluid shown here, and the indium oxide nanowires shown here. The quantum dots are a very interesting nanomaterial because if you shine light of one wavelength on them, they will emit light on the secondary wavelength. However, this emission process never stops. Unlike a conventional organic dye, which, for example, the organic dye that may be used in your clothes, which will eventually bleach over time, quantum dots don't bleach, so they will never fade. So quantum dots are used to make a lot of dyes for doing biolabeling, so labeling of structures within inside a living cell. They're also being used now to make solar cells. So because they don't bleach and their efficiency of excitation and emission never changes, they are an ideal candidate to do energy transfer within a solar cell. In ferrofluids here, a ferrofluid is a magnetic material. So when you put this little tiny magnetic nanoparticle in a magnetic field, it can actually move. So it can go from being down here to being up here. So it's an active material. And researchers have found that this type of ferromagnetic fluid works very, very well in the car engine as a lubricant. However, it is the indium oxide nanowire that is actually an incredibly promising material. One reason is because it undergoes an effect called a piezoelectric effect. So the piezoelectric effect says that when you deform the material, it can generate electrons. And this is reversible, which means that every time you deform it, it will generate electrons. And when you undeform it and then redeform it again, it will generate more electrons. So what researchers have done with this type of material, that's shown here, is they've taken it and embedded it in a very thin polymer film. In doing this, and then putting it on the back of a hamster, whenever the hamster runs, it generates energy. So this is kind of cute, right? But you're not going to get much energy out of a hamster. They've also made gloves out of this material. And when people are typing, they're actually able to generate enough energy, as long as the person types all day, to actually charge a cell phone. which is nice. So they're now moving a step further and actually looking at making basically a stacked layer like this and making it biocompatible so that it can be used as a battery for a pacemaker. Now this solves a huge problem in the pacemaker industry because a pacemaker needs to be implanted inside the body and it needs a battery or power source. However, current batteries which are used with pacemakers need to be replaced about every 5 years. To replace the battery on a pacemaker requires a surgery. People who have pacemakers are already high risk for having complications in surgery. So if you could have something like this, which has essentially an infinite power supply, you would reduce the number of surgeries that people who have pacemakers need to have. So that's why this material could potentially revolutionize people who have pacemakers. And it's an incredible opportunity. Next is something, this little device. So this is a microscope. If you remember on the first slide, I showed the modern day microscope, which is about the size of half of this table. This microscope is about the size of your thumb. It is very tiny. So it basically brings us back to the microscope in the 17th century, which is field portable. However, it doesn't look anything like that microscope. It actually has the same resolution of that huge microscope. This is a picture taken with the huge microscope, and this is the picture taken with this little microscope. They're about the same. And this is just another comparative image of red blood cells. So this is the conventional microscope, and this is this little guy. So this little tiny microscope is able and ideally suited to take pictures in the field of water supplies, looking for bacteria, looking for viruses, looking for any kind of contaminant in a water supply, in a flowing stream. The one downside or limitation of this microscope, when compared to a larger microscope, is that it can only take black and white images. However, it is designed to look for contaminations in water, not to take beautiful images of, fossils and copepods. So for what it's designed to do, it is perfect. So this is an example of advances in optics, advances in fabrication, and potentially advances in communications. Because you could design something like this and then sync it up to a larger network. You could do continuous monitoring of the water supply so that you wouldn't actually need a person monitoring your water supply. You could just have one of these hanging out in an aquifer or in your water supply and continuously monitoring, looking for a contamination event to occur. And finally, researchers are working on developing new types of biosensing technology. So ways to do diagnostics, but also ways to do discovery. So one of the challenges in healthcare is understanding how proteins interact with each other. So understanding how antibodies and antigens interact with each other, how DNA and antibodies interact with each other, how cells interact with other cells. And while there are numerous methods of doing this currently, new methods are always being developed to understand it at both the single molecule and the single cell level. And one of the ways of doing this is using a lot of the tools and technologies that were originally developed for the integrated semiconductor, integrated circuits industry, and now transferring them to the bio community. So these are just a couple pictures showing a protein with a little tiny molecule in its binding pocket. These are two proteins where one protein is in the binding pocket of a second protein, and the same thing here, two DNA strands where something is bound in the binding pocket of the DNA. So, since this is a talk and all of you are students, and there's no way I can cover the entire field, these are just a couple websites. The first is the Grand Challenges. So the National Academy of Engineering was very nice and formulated kind of some major grand challenges, which they would like all engineers to try and solve. If you solve all of them, you get a prize, namely self-satisfaction. The second is the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So OSTP routinely posts kind of the major advances in science and technology, and then the third is the National Nanotechnology Initiative. NNI also posts any advances in nanotechnology. So simply focused on nano, not all of science and technology. Thank you very much.